It's high, high, hey, the army's on its way. Held off on cages loud and strong. For wherever we go, you will always know that the army goes rolling along.
Hi, welcome to Pegasus Research Substack Week in Review Unscripted number 12 podcast. I am Thomas, the founder of, the author for Pegasus Research. I'm an economist, a military historian, and a U.S. Army veteran. If you like my content and want to support my work, please consider becoming a subscriber on Substack or support me on Patreon. The website will be in the description section of this podcast. All right, so we're going to go over to the three primary papers that I wrote, or articles that I wrote on Substack this week. The first one was NATO Ministers Meet in Prague. The second was the Shangri-La Dialogue in Singapore. And the third was the third installment of the West Philippine Sea newsletter. All right, so this is the 12th podcast of this, so time is really going by fast. I'm trying a new way to collect my notes. We'll see how it goes. If this is a failure, I'll go back to the old way of creating all my bullet points to sit there and talk about what we want to discuss this week. I don't have a script, as again, it's unscripted, but I do have some bullet points as retrieval clues, as it would be, to go over some of my thoughts on when writing these papers. So the first one was NATO Ministers Meet in Prague, and the primary purpose of this meeting was creating a policy around donated weapon use to be used in Ukraine. So the official reason was to celebrate Czechia's, or former Czech Republic's, 25th anniversary of NATO membership. This was an unofficial meeting, and it was a foreign ministers meeting, and it's most likely the last meeting prior to the Washington Head of State NATO Summit in July. So, as I said, the main focus of this meeting was to discuss Ukraine to use Western weapons donated to Ukraine against military targets inside Russia. All right, so what this comes from is there was restrictions placed on the use of Western weapons by most of the NATO countries at the beginning of February 2022, that weapons were going to be first defensive in nature. As the war continued, the West started offering more and more weapons, again, for defensive purposes, but they had offensive capability. And Western doctrine is also to attack in depth. So a lot of these, quote, defensive weapons do have long-range capability. The restrictions that the West placed on nearly all these weapons is they cannot be used to attack targets inside Russia. Ukraine could attack inside Russia if it used its own forces, if it used Russian anti-Putin militia forces, if it used its homegrown, its air force is not that significant anymore, though they are training for F-16s in Western Europe and should have them sometime in the summer. But drones, so their own artillery, but it cannot be used using Western ammunition, apparently. So strict usage on donated weapons not to attack Russia. This was also telegraphed to Russia to make the West's point that their war was not with Russia, but just to help Ukraine defend itself against a illegal invasion. So the cat came out of the bag as, first off, Ukraine is short on soldiers. I talked about that in the paper. They were late with their new conscription law. Ukraine did not want to start drafting 18 and 19-year-olds because they're looking at what the future of Ukraine is going to be. And so you still have to have young people available to, quite frankly, just keep the Ukraine population going at some point in the future. So that's why you see the average age of soldiers, Ukrainian soldiers, in the 40s that are fighting the Russian invasion. So they needed more and more of these Western weapons they need that firepower, Western weapons, to make up for the impact of having fewer soldiers available. And it'll probably be sometime late summer before a new wave of conscripts are available to the Ukrainians if they properly train them and just don't throw them into the meat grinder. So obviously Western weapons were delayed as well. So as the Russian spring and summer offensive is underway, Kharkiv was the most popular or the most focused point. That's the second largest city in Ukraine, being under Russian pressure. The discussions became more and more, led by French President Emmanuel Macron, was to lift restrictions on donated Western weapons to Ukraine, where Ukraine could use them however they wanted. This was led by, obviously, French President Emmanuel Macron, and it was later backed by David Cameron, the foreign minister of Great Britain, or the United Kingdom, and who was also the former prime minister of the United Kingdom. And then they started getting tacit support from Secretary of State Antony Blinken and the Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin. But this was not unified in the U.S. about allowing Western weapons to be used in Russia. The President Biden and his national security advisor Jake Sullivan has a very cautious approach, and they tend to be very, very hands-on. Vietnam and LBJ style of control over the war, and not to let it get out of how they view it as out of hand. So they have a very tight control of Western weapons. So that was what was on the agenda, to come up with some type of policy and come up with that policy quickly so that Ukraine could start using the Western weapons that are starting to flow into Ukraine after the delay from both Europe and from the United States. So kind of the history was the flow of Western weapons, mainly from NATO countries, flowed into Ukraine after the Russian invasion of February 22. And this was initially defensive weapons. Stuff like most notably was shoulder-fired anti-tank missiles, like the Javelin, and also the shoulder-fired anti-aircraft missiles. So as the Ukrainians became more and more successful, more and more weapons kept flowing to Ukraine that had, again, more and more capability. The West imposed restrictions on the use of those weapons to prevent escalating the war with Russia, and they telegraphed that to the Russians that they were not going to allow these weapons to be used against Russia. Now, Ukraine did comply with these restrictions, but they weren't happy about it, and they become more vocal, and they found that if they become vocal, they can often get what they want. That's how they got main battle tanks from the West, how they got ATACMS and MLRS systems, how they were getting F-16s. They find that if they appropriately apply pressure on leaders, mainly the Biden administration, they will give in to the Ukrainian demands. So, but Ukraine complied with the restrictions. They weren't happy about it, but they did comply. They did launch cross-border attacks, but that was using their own weapons and their own forces, or the anti-Putin Russian rebels that operate out of Ukraine. And they did attacks, like they did drone attacks in Moscow. That does not include the terrorist attack in that concert in Moscow. And most notably in Belgorod. Belgorod is relatively close to the Ukraine border, so it is relatively in striking distance of Ukrainian forces in eastern Ukraine. That's also part of the reason why the Russians were focusing on the Kharkiv, which is on the, I don't want to say directly on the opposite side, but the closest largest city in Ukraine to Belgorod, is if they could start pushing the Ukrainians back away from the border, it would make harder for the Ukrainians to strike Belgorod with their homegrown weapons or with their special forces. Now, as the Russian spring offensive has begun, they start pressuring the Ukrainian forces. Again, this was to push them back farther away from the border and try to secure Belgorod from being attacked by Ukrainian forces. Obviously, we talked about the deficiency of manpower, equipment delays from the U.S. and Europe pose a challenge to the Ukrainian self-defense. So if you don't have the men, you got to make up with firepower. Obviously, the Russians have about 500,000 troops available for combat inside Ukraine, and they are building a reserve outside of Ukraine. They collect manpower inside the borders of Russia as well. And these, again, are off limits to Western weapons. So French President Emmanuel Macron has been the most vocal leader. He's calling for all types of changes to the EU, offering French weapons to be available for European Union usage, which is completely different than prior nuclear policy of the French. And he's been calling for an end to all restrictions on the donation of Western weapons. Macron has again talked about he's received support from David Cameron. Now, the talk about the use of the weapons is the decision to release restrictions on weapons is up to the individual country that donates weapons, but not all NATO members. Now, where that comes in there, it's like, well, why doesn't every nation just lift the restrictions? Well, when you talk about like U.S. weapons, for example, is when they sell F-16s to, I'm going to just throw a name out there, Denmark. They sell F-16s to Denmark. Denmark cannot sell those weapons to any country they want, even though they purchase them, because there are certain requirements from the U.S. saying that sales of their weapons, even if they've already been bought by another country, the U.S. has to approve any third-party sale. So if Denmark wants to sell it to Ukraine, they don't sell you. Ukraine doesn't buy military equipment, it's donated. But let's say they were going to buy these fighters. The U.S. would have to approve it. So that's what we're going into, Western donated weapons. So this is not like a NATO policy, because this isn't true. This is actually, NATO's coordinating the transfer of weapons. They're coming from NATO's individual countries within NATO's stockpiles. So NATO is coordinating it, but they're not really the ones that are set the policy on this. So, where in NATO, just about every major decision has to have unanimous consent of all member states. Well, this is not the case with the weapon systems. So what you're going to have is you could have 20 different policies on the donation of weapons, as each country that loans their weapons. Even if NATO wants to have a certain policy on it, it's up to the individual countries to put the stipulation of how they want those weapons to be used. European Union can also have its own policy, but for the most part, because the European Union needs unanimous consent, they've been having issues doing military donations within member countries, and for the most part, that's why you're seeing individual European Union countries making individual agreements with Ukraine so that they could get around the unanimous consent rules of the EU. So that's where the stipulations come in. So U.S. has one set of stipulations, Germany has one set, United Kingdom has one set, France has one set. So just because the French want to change the demands for how weapons are used, it's not up to them. It's not up to the NATO Secretary General. It's up to the individual countries. So even though they get pressure and requests and negotiations to try to get changes, it has to be up to each individual country. So some NATO countries led by the U.S., again, are concerned about escalating the war with Russia. You could say Germany's probably into that column as well, and have opposed the use of Western donated weapons to be launched against Russian soil, and they have announced that. So this is well known to the Russians, and the Russians have adjusted their policy accordingly, where they know that the rules of engagement are that prior to this meeting in Czechia, is that Western weapons could only be used, could not be used against Russia or inside Russian soil. So they knew that they could launch artillery attacks, they could launch air attacks, they could do troop gatherings inside Russia, and they knew, based on the rules of engagement, that these areas were off limits to the Ukrainians. So the question is, well, why don't the Ukrainians just attack these no matter what and just gamble? Well, popular support is is hard to come by in Western nations, the United States, with some of the gridlock they have in Congress, but it's not all free up in Europe either, because if it goes through the European Union, you have to have unanimous consent. So there is plenty of delays that occur. So the Ukrainians know that they can't just ignore Western rules and then hope that they can go back with their hat in hand, ask for forgiveness, and the weapons will keep flowing. It's not going to work that way. People that are concerned, politicians that are concerned about the continued war in Ukraine, will use a Ukrainian violation as the Ukrainians are trying to escalate the war and drag the West into a war, and that it's dangerous to continue providing weapons to the Ukrainians if they're going to use them however they want. Now, I'm not saying the Ukrainians would do that, but that is the Ukrainian point of view, is that if they break the rules, that the stipulations that have been placed on Western weapons, it will most likely result in some type of restriction or just outright ban, or even the end of all aid from that particular country. So the Ukrainians have stuck by the deal. So the other issue is that once you announce the policy that says, hey, we will not allow the attack, like an attack or our weapons to be used to attack Russia, Russia has taken that as it's an advantage to them, if you know that you're off limits, but now you're changing the rules. You're changing the rules. That's an escalation. So to the Russians, this is an escalation. Now, what Russia could have done, and what they've kind of said, is they said they put their own escalations on this. Is that if you change this policy, this opens up the nuclear weapons, the ability to use nuclear weapons. I don't think that's going to happen. They've threatened that in the past. I don't think they're going to do it, and not because they have some moral some moral objection to using nuclear weapons. I'm not saying that they're necessarily frothing at the mouth to use nuclear weapons, but they do have Russia has the most nuclear weapons in the world. I think what they're concerned about is they would most likely lose Chinese support, and a nuclear attack inside Ukraine will probably bring about some type of NATO response against Russia. So Russia knows that the stakes are too high. But short of nuclear weapons, they don't know what this will do. So that's when you set some rules, very finite rules, and you telegraph those rules. The West would have been better off to sit there and say, there's no rules. They could sit there behind closed doors, say, we prefer you not to attack, but don't put the rules out there, because if you decide, Ukraine, you can go ahead and use these Western weapons against Russian targets, it's not an escalation because you've never said that out loud. Now, it depends. Russia might view it as an escalation, but it's not a stated point. If you don't sit there and state it, it's the Russians have some self-restraint because, hey, if we cross this line, they could attack us. They could just all of a sudden decide that they're going to use those Western weapons against targets in Russia. But when you sit there and say, no, we're not going to allow these weapons to be used, when you change your mind, that is an escalation. The Russians have acted in accordance to the rules that their soil is off limits to Western weapons, and now the rules have changed. That is an escalation, and the West can expect, Ukraine can expect some type of escalation from the Russians in response. Now, what that will be, not sure. It could be more attack on civilian infrastructure. It could be directed towards, we know that the French have troops there, 1,500 French Foreign Legionnaires in there. Could it be something not necessarily, maybe not attacking them directly, but attacking some of their facilities? There will be some form of escalation. Or it could be cyber warfare. It could be pushing more refugees up to the Finnish border. It could be they also started moving some of the buoys in the Baltic Sea that divided the Baltic countries from Russia. So there's going to be something, because the West, by agreeing to use of Western donated weapons, have created an escalation. Now, is this free use of Western weapons like the NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg wanted to use or what Emmanuel Macron wanted to use? No. The U.S. came up with a policy that's saying that they would allow its weapons that it's donated to Ukraine to be used against targets in Russia, but to the extent the use is against troop gatherings on the Russian side of the border and artillery positions. So it is still actually considered defensive in nature because they can't just use them to launch a offensive into Russia. These are made to, if there's gathering of troops, if there's artillery coming from being fired across the border, those are eligible to be attacked by Western weapons. So it's not can't be used as a general offensive to launch attacks against Moscow or something like that. They are meant to be specifically to defensive in nature against threats that are gathering on the Russian side of the border. The Germany has also changed their stance, and again, it's closer to the U.S. And they did. Olaf Scholz did. That's the Chancellor of Germany. He mirrored his decision. If the U.S. was going to allow it, Germany would allow it. And so Germany has very similar but slightly more restrictive rules than the U.S. Germany said that their weapons that they donated can be used against targets in Russia if it's for formations used to attack Kharkiv. So artillery used to attack Kharkiv, troop concentrations on the other side of Kharkiv to break up their ability to push into Ukraine. Those are all eligible for it, and it's the German restriction sounds like it's something that has to be close to the border. Now, coming out of the Czechia meeting, they nobody said what close to the border is. Is that just on the other side? Is it 10 miles? Or let's say 6 miles, 10 kilometers, 12 miles, 20 kilometers. What is it? And so they don't have that stated. Probably best they don't either state it, because then if you say 20 kilometers, well, 12 miles is, or 13 miles. So if you, or I'm sorry, it's every 5 is 3. So 12 miles. So in 12 miles in, what you do is you say, okay, well, I'll just put my forces 13 miles away. So that's outside the range. So it's probably best that they don't say what the limit is as far as cross-border. So both the U.S. and Germany are somewhat guilty of that. Hopefully, they will learn their lessons and not exactly state what other side of the border really means. I'm sure there's probably some rules of discussion about that. And maybe something that was told to the Ukrainians. Maybe they just say, hey, if these are being directed towards Ukraine and they're 25 miles inside the border, okay, they're eligible for attack. But these here, but you have another, let's say, food trucks, they're 20 miles away from the border. Well, maybe they're not eligible for attack. I don't know. They don't say what the rules of engagement are. They don't tell what the distance. They just say on the other side of the border. Now, the Germans say threats against Kharkiv. The U.S. is a little bit more ambiguous about it. Do they mean that they can attack across the border anywhere along the 1,000-kilometer front, 600-mile front, or does it mean just around where a general offensive is, for example, Kharkiv? That's the only ones that can be attacked. And they don't specify if airfields can be attacked. Now, it's probably, again, best that they don't sit there and say, or the U.S. doesn't sit there and say what is eligible and what isn't eligible. Keep the Russians guessing. Let's not, hopefully they don't repeat the same mistake. But this White House does like to have a tight control on the war, and not sure if they have to approve targets from the White House prior to allowing them to be attacked inside Russia. Again, this feels very much like a Lyndon Baines Johnson Vietnam War strategy to try to keep the war very much under wraps. Again, Vietnam War, LBJ was worried about President Lyndon Baines Johnson, for anybody that doesn't live in the United States, he was always called LBJ. He was maintained very tight controls because he was also worried about expanding the war in Vietnam, and he didn't want to have an excuse for the Russians or even the Chinese to become involved in the war. So this seems like the White House is still very restrictive on how they use the weapons. It's just a matter of how restrictive are they? Are they down to the point of picking targets? That is unclear. It would not surprise me that since they did not give full use of the weapons, I am sure the White House has some control and some decision making in what is allowed to be attacked. So again, so they can try to keep the battlefield from spinning out of control. Is this the right way to run the war? No. Again, I came from a period of post-Vietnam. It was drilled in our heads about air-land battle, and you didn't do the mistakes of Vietnam. Lloyd Austin, the Secretary of Defense, is very much from that mindset, and he is also of that post-Vietnam era. So they will probably tend to not want approvals or want it to be directed out of the White House. But the White House still calls the shots. He's the commander-in-chief. But if he's going to restrict if he's going to pick the targets, again, if he at least leaves some ambiguity and doesn't start setting red lines where, okay, we won't attack more than 10 miles inside the border, then everything else is off limits. Well, then they're just going to place everything 10 and a half miles inside the border, meaning the Russians. So hopefully they'll be learned from their mistakes. They made the decision to escalate the war. They have to be willing to accept the consequences of that escalation. But hopefully they will not repeat that mistake by setting these red lines just so that they maybe have to cross them again someday. So I guess I've already talked about why the reason was escalatory is, again, they put red lines. They need to avoid making any more red lines. They made this escalation. The West should not push for another escalation by placing some type of demand or some type of restriction and then turn around and break it later. I think the German position is probably somewhat flexible, even though it's Kharkiv. Well, what if they the Russians switch their offensive strategy to some other point along the front that could cause a breakout? It sounds like the Germans are going to say, well, then if that's the center point of the Russian offensive, then that's where German weapons can be used against Russian targets. I think Kharkiv came up because that's been the publicized point, and it is, again, the second largest city in Ukraine. So that's probably why that's why it's been the most discussed point. I think the U.S. and Germany have a strategy right now. Germany says that Kharkiv is the only place they could be focused. I'm sure if as the summer and spring and summer offensives continue, the Germans will be somewhat flexible. Again, my hope is if they've chosen this path of escalation, that they truly do not put any other restrictions that the Russians can use to set their strategy, or turns around, the West has to break it and create another escalation. Because at some point when you create more and more escalations, eventually are you going to go off a cliff, or do you risk going off a cliff? It's better to just go back, and I harp this a lot in my paper, strategic ambiguity. If you're going to choose this path, do not telegraph what you're going to do. That's a big mistake that's done by politicians. In my experience in the U.S., I would say that obviously the U.S. is more involved in military operations than the Europeans. That's not meant as a slight towards the Europeans, but that's where I've seen the U.S. put these types of lines saying what the U.S. will and won't do, and that creates problems. So sure, more to come, especially as we see more and more weapons from the West that were delayed starting to arrive in Ukraine. Again, I will keep going back to my point is I I won't go into the mistakes made by the West and the Russians to allow this invasion and the suffering of the Ukrainian people. My point is this war needs to find an off-ramp. It needs to end before things get out of hand. There is the the peace conference in Switzerland coming up the middle of this month, this month's June 8th, 2024. I think the meeting starts a week from today. It's a waste of time, but maybe something good will come out of it. So off to talk about the Shangri-La dialogue in Singapore, and we'll come back to some of the peace discussions as President Zelensky made let's just go into it. President Zelensky, the Shangri-La dialogue was a conference in Singapore, mainly to discuss defense issues in the Indo-Pacific region. Well, I don't know. We've all looked at a map before, and we've all seen Ukraine doesn't border the Pacific at all. It does not border the Indian Ocean at all. But President Zelensky shows up at the Shangri-La dialogue in Singapore. He wasn't there for the opening. So it's like, why is Ukraine showing up at an Indo-Pacific peace conference? Well, apparently it was twofold. So first off, I guess maybe three, is I guess to sit there and say, well, why is he here? They did allow President Zelensky of Ukraine to be a participant in a discussion on global peace. And you could probably argue that that's the way it kind of fits in, that's what he was there for. I would say that most of the organizers, outside of China, most of the organizers of the dialogue do have some level of sympathy for the Ukrainian cause. And I think allowing President Zelensky to join the conference was a show of moral support from many of the organizers of the conference. And just to give you an idea, the organizers of the conference have not allowed Russia to participate in the Shangri-La dialogue. This has been going on for 21 years. They've disinvited Russia since 2022. And Russia is a Pacific country. So it does have a large part of its borders, its eastern borders on the Pacific. So it is a Pacific country. It has usually been at these dialogues, but it has been uninvited. So there's obviously some sympathy on the organizers of the conference to the Ukrainian cause, and I would say outside of the Chinese who were there at the conference, again, they're also a Pacific country, is that support for the Ukrainian cause and kind of an antipathy towards Russia. The agenda appears to demonstrate to China that, let's kind of go back. We'll come back to that part later. So the Ukrainians, a non-Pacific country, did show up at the conference to talk about global peace. It is also stated that there was some chiding from Ukrainian leadership to the Chinese to why they're not participating in the global peace conference in Switzerland in the middle of June. So the Chinese have been very public and said they will not participate. As I wrote this paper about 3 or 4 weeks ago about the Swiss Peace Conference, the Russians aren't invited either. So the Russians have no representation. The Chinese have decided to boycott this peace conference. President Zelensky was there to try to gather more countries to join in the conference, basically trying to create this coalition to show that much of the world's against the Russian invasion, which is probably true. But the peace conference I think there's not a lot of support for the Ukrainian 10-point peace plan, and that's kind of falling apart. Even the Russian foreign ministry had talked about, well, they kind of got talked into this, but they're like, why can you have a peace conference without one of the primary combatants, or at least somebody representing the Russian interests, which could be China, at this peace conference? There's nobody there, and the Chinese aren't going to participate in this. The Russians aren't invited to it, so this is kind of a waste of time. And it seems like the support for this is starting to soften. So Zelensky's trying to gather more people to commit to come to the conference, because it doesn't do any good if this conference goes and it's 15 NATO countries showing up in Japan and South Korea. It doesn't really show a unity to end the war. So he's got to, even if his peace plan is not going to be accepted, the Ukrainian president has to get participation. So he's there at this peace conference trying to get commitments for countries to show up, and also trying to chide the Chinese about why they're not showing up. Also, he probably needs to make sure that China doesn't pressure other participants of the Shangri-La dialogue not to participate in the conference. China is famous for using their weight to try to push people around. You just ask the Philippines that, and we'll get to that here in a little bit. So, go back to the beginning of the Shangri-La dialogue, and after I just revisited of President Zelensky there. So, the Shangri-La dialogue in Singapore, the tensions are high in the region. Obviously, you've got the ongoing issues with the threat to invade Taiwan, China threatening to invade Taiwan, the Philippine and China clashes in the West Philippine Sea as China violates the exclusive economic zone of the Philippines. Also, they're apparently China is apparently making some what is it? Basically, they're changing the what is Chinese territory and what is Vietnam territory in the Gulf of Tonkin. And so they're getting in escalations with Vietnam as well. So it's obviously there's a lot going on in the Asia Pacific with China. And so it is unclear whether this meeting, the Shangri-La dialogue, again, it's been going on for 21 years. So tensions are high. It's unclear if this meeting was served to prevent an escalation or an opportunity for countries to put a stake in their immovable positions that could lead to future conflicts. They're basically that countries are saying, nope, no more, or China saying, no, we're claiming the whole South China Sea, and there's end of discussion. So as things get more and more heated, was this again an opportunity to try to de-escalate, or was this a opportunity for all countries to say, this is our position and you can't change my mind? So that's what the Shangri-La dialogue is going into. So the Shangri-La dialogue is the International Institute for Strategic Studies. They call it the Shangri-La dialogue in Singapore. This is the 21st gathering. The official part is the meeting aims to discuss pressing security issues in the region, the Asia Indo-Pacific region, with 45 countries, 49 ministers, and let's see, here was my note say 40 defense officials attending the meeting. Again, this is a chance for, like many of the other meetings, there's roundtables, there are keynote addresses, there's also an opportunity for powers to have bilateral meetings on, as you could say, the sidelines of these meetings to discuss defense-related matters and address policy positions of various countries. And this is where I kind of go back, is the isolation of Russia. And this even happened prior to the invasion of Ukraine. In fact, you could go back to 2017 as contacts with Russia was weaponized against political opponents on both sides of the Atlantic. Well, that's breaking down communications against two of the biggest nuclear-powered countries in the world. Even during the Cold War, you kept some, after the Cuban Missile Crisis, it was purposely set up that there was communication channels and back channel ways for the countries, the U.S. and the Soviet Union, to talk to each other and prevent any type of mistakes in that. That is gone now. So, talk about this meeting in this defense-related situation, Russia being a Pacific country, an ally of China, is not invited to this meeting. So there's a lot of these high-level officials that have these sideline meetings, these bilateral talks with each other to make their positions clear, but not try to advertise it. Well, those are one of the things that, even if you don't allow Russia to participate, and I could see that, not allowing them because they are they did initiate invasion. They should not be allowed to advertise their aggressive position to the world. But maybe they are allowed to at least have some form of presence there. Again, not allowed to participate in roundtables, maybe not even allowed to answer questions, but at least for them to be there. I think it's a mistake. I think it's a mistake to completely cut off Russia from having any discussion, contact with any of these international forums, because it's, again, the Cold War mentality. Even in the height of the Cold War, in 1983 with Able Archer, there was a back channel way for the countries to communicate with each other. So I think it's a mistake to cut off, unless you're at war, and we're not with Russia. There should be a more open dialogue. Doesn't mean you have to agree with them. Most of the Cold War, we never agreed with Russia, but there was, or the Soviet Union, they didn't agree with us, but at least there was at least some level of communication. This idea of cutting them off completely of all these international forums outside of going to allowing Russia to participate in some echo chamber type meetings, like you could say BRICS, or even U.S. When they kicked. I could see not allowing the Russia into the G7 when it used to be called the G8 when Russia was involved. I could see not allowing them on that, but there's other conversations where the U.S. just doesn't need to be talking into an echo chamber, especially in regards to Russia, and vice versa. I think that there needs to be some way to start opening up the communication lines to, again, especially when you're allowing Western weapons to be used in Ukraine against Russian targets, that maybe you need to have more communication to keep the things from spinning out of control. So again, I'm getting off topic. The Shangri-La dialogue does not allow the Russians to participate. That means no sideline discussions between the West and Russia, unless maybe they're talking to China. But China's got their own issues in here, so I don't think China's going to spend a lot of time at the Shangri-La dialogue there to represent a Russian point of view. The Chinese have not stepped up to be there. To be the Russian stand-in. Like, for example, I think the Swiss embassy in Iran is the U.S. Stand-in to talk to the Iranians. Chinese don't agree to do that anywhere for the Russians. So some of the sideline meetings was Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin and Chinese Defense Minister, who's relatively new, Dong Yung, I think, hopefully I pronounced that right, met on the sidelines to discuss the ongoing tensions. Obviously, the Philippines, Taiwan were high on the mind, freedom of navigation. And the Chinese side is opposition to the number of alliances, including what the Chinese said is that the U.S. is trying to create something like NATO in the Pacific, whether NATO itself or a NATO-like alliance in the Pacific. I wrote about that before too. That is a difficult proposition because unlike the European countries, the small geographical location, the Pacific is a wide expanse, and many of these countries have different levels of threats against, let's say, the Chinese or North Koreans. They also have different interests, and they have different tolerance levels to what China does and doesn't do. So they have a more diverse issues in the Pacific than you will find in Western, Central, and Eastern Europe. So the Chinese point of view was, okay, U.S. point of view is the Chinese aggression, South China Sea, Taiwan. Obviously some economic issues. The Chinese concerned about the U.S. forming alliances against them in the Pacific. Again, China is very clear. They do not want any, quote, foreign, unquote, powers or influences to be brought into any of the South China Sea disputes or the Taiwan disputes, which again, the Chinese say Taiwan is an internal issue. Blah, blah, blah. I've gone into that where they haven't been. The Chinese communists were never a presence on Taiwan. Taiwan has not been, before that was Formosa, has not been part of the Chinese dynasty for well over 100 years. So, no, there's no reunification of Taiwan, but again, that was one of the points of discussions on there. So Secretary Austin emphasized the importance of Indo-Pacific region to the U.S. and stating that Asia's security directly impacts the U.S. security. So you do see this pivot. Seems like Europe's always pulling the U.S. back in this direction with the Ukraine war, but the U.S. is wanting to pivot more and more to Asia, and that's part of the French push. There is obviously that self-interest by the French of wanting to fill the vacuum of the U.S., and they would be more than happy to reduce the influence of the U.S. in Europe. But Macron's point of view is the U.S. has commitments in Asia that Europe doesn't have, and Europe needs to be able to stand on its own without U.S. Reliance on the U.S. in Europe. So the U.S. is obviously directly impacted by U.S. security. Again, China is the second biggest economy in the world. It has aggressive positions and claims in the South China Sea. So there's a lot of focusing on the U.S. fostering alliances in the Indo-Pacific region to counter the aggressive stance. Talked about that China demands that all countries in the regions work with China only on a bilateral basis and do not add foreign elements into the region. So this was a response to, you got Austin talking about the Asia security is U.S. security. You got the Chinese saying, no, that's a foreign element being brought into the South China Sea or closer to their borders, where they say that's basically their sphere of influence. They say, so the U.S. is trying to form alliances to take away or put more opposition and increase the cost to China if it continues on its aggressive actions and threats in the China Sea. The Chinese, in response, says the U.S. is stoking fears in the region and incentivizing countries to seek alliances against China. So there's a lot of finger pointing going on in that meeting. But it was the first time the two defense ministers of China and the U.S. have talked in over 18 months. So that was a positive, even if they didn't agree on a single thing. At least they were talking. Not the defense minister, but one of Chinese general was there, Li Shengfu, that's what I got down here, advocates for what he calls open and inclusive cooperation in the South China Sea. Again, that kind of goes back to the whole idea of bilateral. He's arguing that dividing up the region into blocks, these alliances that the U.S. is pushing, destabilize the region, and he's advocating for bilateral approaches. Any type of bilateral approach, especially with the smaller powers in the Indo-Pacific, is always to China's advantage. So, yeah, China's going to be self-interest to try to keep countries from forming some type of pact against China, because China finds it easier to use its economic and military power to bully smaller countries into cooperating with them. So, yeah, it's in the Chinese interest to continue to keep a what they call open inclusive cooperation, which means it's somebody that a region that is subject to Chinese intimidation and threats. So obviously the Chinese responded heavily towards the U.S. position, where the U.S. is trying to build security alliances, and China is countering that no, this is just creating a destabilizing situation, and that it's a foreign element trying to stoke fears into the region. Now, I've talked about this every week. I think it's an important subject, is the Philippines and Chinese disputes. And that's where I think that this is the purpose of the meeting, is they gave Philippine President Ferdinand Marcos Jr. the keynote address at this dialogue. So obviously he's been in this him in the Philippines have been in an ongoing dispute in the South China Sea, in what we call the West Philippine Sea, which is, if you had to subdivide it, that's the West Philippine Sea is the Philippines' internationally recognized exclusive economic zone in the South China Sea. The Philippines designate that area, their EEZ in the South China Sea, as the West Philippine Sea. So he's accused China, I think rightly so, of its aggressive actions, and is accusing China, of dictating regional security and economic evolution. Kind of what I saw, the idea is it's in their best interest, China's best interest, to keep all discussions, negotiations, disagreements on a bilateral approach, because that is where China is the strongest, where they can dictate regional security and economic evolution. They will have all the power if they can keep everybody divided. United you stand, divided you fall. That's China's position in the South China Sea. They do not want any type of alliances. Everything has to be bilateral. So he's Marcos Jr., who Philippines has a defense agreement with the United States, and he states that, unlike the Chinese, who say that the U.S. being involved in this is a destabilizing factor in the region, President Marcos is saying it's a stabilizing factor in the region. This is what keeps China from going too far overboard, because there is that backstop in the Philippines of the U.S. Philippine Defense Pact. The Philippines also has one with Japan. Probably not quite as robust as the U.S., but it's a pretty significant defensive alliance. So if they take full benefit, meaning the Japanese Filipinos take full benefit of it, that means that Philippine troops can be put on Japanese soil and vice versa. So if China pushes too far, they could pull the Japanese into a conflict. So he's saying that this is that moderating, the U.S. alliance with the Philippines is a moderating factor for the amount of, or the aggression that China can exert in the West Philippine Sea, because they know they can only go so far because of that alliance with the United States. They can't go in there and start shooting up Philippine boats without the threat of U.S. intervention due to the defensive agreement. So Marcos did say he did not want to align with either superpower, as he states, and he's giving this, is that China plays a role in the prosperity of the Indo-Pacific region. And that is certainly true. Again, second biggest economy in the world. It's right there in the region. It does have a role to play. It's over a billion people. You can't deny the factor that it does have a role to play. To try to allay those fears that Philippines just wants their recognition of their exclusive economic zone in the West Philippine Sea, they've not taken a stance on Taiwan. They don't want to provoke China on a matter of what the Chinese consider as an internal affair. The Philippines have made a point that they do not want to interfere one way or another with this. They just want an internationally recognized rights of its exclusive economic zone, and all its defensive alliances and all its alignments are for that purpose. No other purpose is allowed. Now, does he truly believe that? I think so. There's no other indication that the Philippines has any designs on any other parts of the Pacific. So I think that is probably I would say 9 out of 10, that's a true statement that the Philippines just wants to be able to coexist with China and have China recognize its international rights of its exclusive economic zone, which the China's claim of the 9-dash line in the entire South China Sea is contrary to international law. And he wants recognition of the Philippines' sovereignty and its right to exist and to operate legally within its internationally recognized territorial waters, or at least economic waters. So China, again, you can dress them up, but you can't take them out anywhere. So the Chinese had people in the audience during the keynote address challenging the President Marcos on stage. This was not meant to reach any type of dialogue. This was meant to, it was show. It was a show of not allowing President Marcos to give his point of view in this address. If the Chinese wanted to make a counter point of view, they could have asked the dialogue, the organizers of the dialogue to allow them to perform their own roundtable or give another address to talk about their position. But they've made a point of aggressively and disrespecting the president of the Philippines in a public audience. And again, it shows that China has no regards for international diplomatic norms. So they could say, okay, well, it was an army officer. Well, it's the Chinese Communist Party. The PLA, People's Liberation Army, is not China's army. It is the Chinese Communist Party's army. You cannot separate out military from political policy, because the army is part of the state or part of the party. The party runs the state, so the lines are blurred. So this whole thing is saying that, oh, okay, well, it was just it was a military and not a diplomatic is, again, that is an incorrect, and basically is the Chinese trying to play off of ignorance of that this is not a normal regards of how a Western army that's set up in the Clausewitzian model, for lack of a better word, where, again, it's a communist party. The military represents the state, or I'm sorry, the party. So, again, China cannot, they just have no regards for international organizations. Just like last week, talking about them tape recording a diplomatic conversation between a Philippine official and a Chinese diplomat, and then releasing it to the world. Again, they just don't play with the normal international norms. So this kind of goes back is they did give the keynote speaker address to Ferdinand Marcos. Now, so it appears that they wanted that the agenda appears to demonstrate to China that its actions in the regions could isolate it from few allies if it persists on its current policies. So they definitely gave, by giving like somebody like Ferdinand Marcos a primary address, giving Lloyd Austin, allow him to address the audience. Now the Chinese speakers were allowed to speak as well, but it definitely seemed like it was being tailored to show China what their actions in the region are doing and causing more problems. So I think this is where it goes into, is that they're probably trying to signal, hey, China, you got to listen to what's going on in the region, and eventually you're just going to isolate themselves. I guess if you're going to argue that, no, that wasn't the meaning of the meeting, there was about 6 weeks ago a naval conference, the Western Pacific Naval Conference. I can't remember the exact name of it. That was in China. It was hosted in China this year. It goes every other year. And China was, they were the ones that they've got to basically lecture just about every country in the Western Pacific on China's purposes. So maybe you could say that this dialogue was a rebuttal to the statements of China when it was running the Western Pacific Naval Symposium. So that could be a possibility, but it just definitely seems like this was a opportunity of the organizers of the Shangri-La Dialogue to make or have China listen to what's going on in the region, make them aware of the audience in the area. So again, it did feel like it was somewhat one-sided to China, and it seemed like maybe it was the last chance to show China the cost of their regional policies. Or again, going back to it, it could have been it was a response to the Western Naval Symposium, which again, China did not follow normal international norms where they sit all these people in there and treat them like hostages to sit there and tell them what they're doing wrong and that China is the righteous power in the region. So that was the Shangri-La Dialogue. I already talked about President Zelensky showing up and getting support as well, which again, that tells me more and more that it wasn't necessarily what happened in the Western Naval Symposium as much as it's the organizers of the Shangri-La Dialogue wanted to show China exactly what their policies are doing in the region and what the costs of it. And again, as I said, is this a chance to open dialogue, or is it to put a stake in the ground to show what everybody's position is going to be? So that's the Shangri-La Dialogue. I don't see much coming out of that as far as follow-on meetings. Obviously, there will be other meetings in the area. Don't expect any follow-up on that. But there's other things to talk about. The West Philippine Sea newsletter. So we will, Volume 3. So we will see more or read more about what's coming out of China's attitudes, bad behaviors, breaking of norms in the South China Sea. A lot of it will show up in the West Philippine Sea newsletter, Volume 3. So this did okay. It's not gangbusters, but when I look on X, I'm one of the biggest writers of what's going on in the West Philippine Seas. Again, I will sit there and talk over and over again. Obviously, the U.S. had some major involvements in the Philippines, some for the bad. You could sit there and say the Spanish-American War and U.S. colonization. But you could sit there and say that the Philippines, no better friend and no worse enemy. So I do mean that, and I will continue. Hopefully this will get more popularity or have some type of traction where I can continue to write about what I view as an important issue, or maybe I need to write better to try to convince people of the importance of what's going on in the West Philippine Sea. So again, this week seemed like a little, didn't seem like a lot of current events, just about events that had happened and were just starting to get some traction, and so it kind of showed up into the news feeds this week. So again, showing that China's putting pressure on the Philippines, but it does, I talked about this last week about the Philippines government strategy to be transparent, try to get, internalize the issue so that the Chinese people, or not the Chinese people, the Philippine people are well aware of what the Chinese are doing in denying the Philippines their sovereignty, their rights to use the resources that are given to, or that they're allowed to use in their exclusive economic zones in the West Philippine Sea. So a lot of that policy, again, is working because the Philippines are being open and transparent with what's going on. So, talk about there's two major disputes around the second Thomas Shoal on May 19th and the May 24th. Again, this is June 8th. So these were coming out about roughly 2 weeks after they occurred. The first incident was at the second Thomas Shoal on May 19th involving a mission to the grounded Philippine Navy ship, the Sierra Madre. Did find out, I'm trying to find the conversation. There is a Marine contingent on that ship to help the Philippines maintain their goal by keeping a manned presence on that rusted out World War II troop ship. That there's only 7 Marines on that boat or on that ship, on that grounded ship at any one time. So obviously they do rotate these Marines in and out. They do have to have supplies. Most of the time, supplies are brought in by have been brought in by boat, but lately the Chinese Coast Guard has been using water cannons against the ships. They've done ramming, try to keep resupplies from reaching the Marines, the Philippine Marines on the Sierra Madre. So the Secretary of Defense, the Philippine Secretary of Defense, I think it was Gilbert Teodoro. Excuse me if I mispronounced that. He said they're going to change the tactics. So they chose to do the resupply mission to the Sierra Madre was not boats, but it was an airdrop by a Philippine Navy aircraft. Again, don't see the Chinese going to the point of trying to shoot down an aircraft. Well, first off, for the most part, their Navy or their Air Force can't extend that far out from the first island chain. As long as they're hemmed in by the first island chain. And then also Chinese aircraft carriers are not operating in the area. That would be difficult for them to operate in that area anyway, because they would be out of land-based air cover. So using a Navy aircraft to try to resupply is probably a smart way to do it, probably a little less accurate than trying to transfer supplies from the boats. Still an issue of trying to transfer personnel on and off of the Sierra Madre using aircraft. But he did say, the Defense Minister Teodoro said that they were going to change the tactics, and that they did. They chose to do an airdrop. So the Chinese ships were there, the Coast Guard was there and ready. And when the airdrops were made, the Chinese Coast Guard launched rubber boats and went after the supplies that were floating in the water that was meant for the Philippine Marines. And it was witnessed that the Chinese Coast Guardmen were taking the supplies and opening them up and dumping them in the water to deny the usage of them. And some were even seen taking them back to the Coast Guard ships where they were kept, and then some were also thrown overboard, again, to keep the Philippines from using it. Now, the Philippines did say that the supplies that were seized were within 5 to 10 meters of the Sierra Madre, and that most of the supplies were recovered by the Philippine Marines. Now, we did run into, there was an accusation, and this is where it started making to the rounds, was about this incident, was there was an accusation by the Chinese Maritime Militia and the Chinese Coast Guard that the Philippine Marines on board were seen pointing guns at the Chinese Coast Guard crews that were seizing Philippine provisions. The Philippine Armed Forces, their chiefs of staff, denied the Chinese claim, stating that the troops were acting within the rules of engagement, and they did have weapons at the ready, but they were not pointing them at Chinese personnel. But they're not denying that they did not have weapons. They did say that the Chinese were operating in an aggressive and reckless manner that endangered a Philippine naval vessel, which is true, and that the Marines were acting within the rules of engagement and did not point their weapons, but did have them at the ready at the guard to defend the ship if necessary. So kind of a statement where they said, well, no, we didn't point the weapons, but they didn't deny that they were willing to take weapons out to be at the ready for the Chinese aggressive actions of stealing supplies. Also during that time is the Chinese Coast Guard used water cannons to obstruct some personnel transfers, and they used, again, water cannons against rubber boats. They also tried to ram one of the motorboats and damage one of the Philippine motorboats. But they didn't stop the transfer of the personnel. I tried to find more information about this, and it seemed purposely vague. So I'm not sure if they were, the Philippines were trying to do a crew rotation, or the official statement from the Philippines was that they were moving sick personnel from one craft to another. So I'm not sure if these were coming from the Sierra Madre and they were trying to rotate out somebody, or if this was something else going on. But it, again, that doesn't make the Chinese activity anywhere justified, because, again, this is internationally recognized territory of the Philippines. There was also, on May 24th, there was another engagement where a water cannon from the Chinese Coast Guard was used against a Philippine fishing boat in the second Thomas Shoal. There was no reports of any injuries and no reports of damage in that incident. But again, they are using those water cannons on a ready basis. One thing that does goes in there, it kind of goes back to what President Marcos was saying at the Shangri-La Dialogue, is that there would be no reciprocal action from the Philippines against the Chinese. That means that the Philippines are not going to use water cannons against the Chinese. They're not going to use industrial lasers or heavy lasers against Chinese crews like the maritime militia has used against Philippine crews. There would be no reciprocal action on here, but it has not stopped the Chinese from using that. Now, this goes back into the transparency issue, is much of the action of the actions of the Chinese Coast Guard of stealing those supplies in the Sierra Madre, that has been caught on tape and that has been broadcasted to the world. Chinese did also release a picture of a rather grainy picture of what looks like a Philippine Marine with arms at the ready. It's pretty grainy, so either was taken up and down on a bobbing boat or was taken from a fairly long distance away. But the Philippines did not deny it happened. So another incident that occurred, is I've mentioned this before, is the Escoda Shoal, where I think this was probably in the first newsletter, in the Escoda Shoal, which is also in the West Philippine Sea, part of the Philippine internationally recognized exclusive economic zone. The Philippines had discovered the signs that the Chinese, most likely the Chinese, they did not say that specifically, though they did say that Chinese vessels were in the area. The Chinese also have a history of creating artificial islands in the 9-dash line, which is the border region around what they claim is the South China Sea. They did find signs of a ground-up coral being used to try to build up the reef at the Escoda Shoal. This is really close to the Philippines' main islands. Also, it would limit the Philippines' ability to operate into the second Thomas Shoal if the Chinese created a permanent artificial island at the Escoda Shoal. So the Philippines tried to counter the Chinese actions by permanently stationing their largest Coast Guard ship out there, along with 2 smaller vessels out there, to basically stay a permanent presence out there to keep the Chinese from trying to permanently build up the island. They made the point of the biggest ship is that I've talked about this before, is the Chinese Coast Guard vessels, most of them are retired People's Liberation Army Navy ships that have been disarmed as far as normal anti ship missiles and anti-aircraft missiles have been taken off of them, but these are bigger ships than what your average Coast Guard cutter is. So it's easier for the Chinese Coast Guard to use ramming techniques because they have a much larger tonnage advantage against Philippine ships. So they can ram with very little, China can ram other ships with very little concern about damaging their own ships. When the Taiwanese or the Philippines put their largest ship out there, Coast Guard ship, it's going to be much harder for China to try to ram a large Philippine Coast Guard ship without damaging themselves, especially that far from home, meaning the Chinese Coast Guard. So the Philippines, when they found this, they said they're going to keep a permanent presence out there. They're going to, or at least keep a Coast Guard presence out there. They were going to keep the Chinese Coast Guard at bay, and then they were going to do an investigation. Well, it looks to find out where that grounded coral came from. Did it come from the Escoda Shoal? Did it come from some other location in the South China Sea, West Philippine Sea? Well, the Philippines said that they have found evidence of coral reef damage in both the Roselle Reef and the Escoda Shoal. So they said coral reef damage and seabed damage, which could be dredging up materials from the seabed floor to try to make an artificial island. So the Philippines Department of Justice said they are close to finalizing a legal environmental case against China for damaging the seabed and the coral reefs in the shoals and the reef and the Roselle Reef. So it does look like I wrote that again. This is any type of genius talk that I thought that they were just going to get ready to prepare another case to take China to court. So that looks like they are going to do that. And again, that would be part of the idea of it's not going to change China's actions. China will not recognize any type of arbitration coming out from this or anything that happened in 2016, the two cases that ruled against them. China is not going to listen. But it's, again, highlighting to the world what China is doing and, again, showing that China's behaviors is outside the norms of internationally accepted law of the sea. So the Philippines have not designated the venue that they would take it, but looks like they are going to file a lawsuit against China for damaging Philippine territory or exclusive economic zone waters, and most likely they will take it to the Permanent Court of Arbitration in The Hague, but that's still yet to be determined. But again, it's to highlight the illegal actions and show the aggressive actions that China is doing, but also specifically showing what China is doing to the Philippines. And this is the idea is that it's going to start internalizing the idea that they're going to that China is their own worst enemy. They just keep doing this, and the Philippines are recording it. They protest it. They counter it where they can. They have agreed. They have chosen a policy not to mirror the Chinese actions. Basically, they're not going to get into the mud with the Chinese. And this is where their policy is starting to work. They are going to show what China is doing, and the Philippine people will internalize it. That this, again, national pride with this. Here, basically, that the Chinese government is trying to deny the sovereignty of the Philippine people and the opportunity allowed to them. Because again, there's gas and oil deposits in the exclusive economic zone for the Philippines, but there's also fisheries in that location, and that's part of a way of life for many people in the Philippines. And the Chinese are trying to deny the people their sovereign rights. So that's a big part of what the Philippines policy is doing. And the idea is that when President Marcos' term is over, that showing what China is doing to the Philippine people will carry forward in future administrations. And there will be a policy to go in there because that's what the Philippine people are going to want, they're going to want their sovereignty, they're going to want their economic rights. At least that seems to be the theory, and it looks like that's what it is really starting to have an impact. As I said also in previous articles, is a war. China having a war in the Philippines is a war they don't want to have, and the Philippines know it. Again, we can go into top conversations about the first island chain, Chinese air cover. It's like, okay, well, China can choose Taiwan or they can choose the Philippines. They can't choose both. But if they wanted to eventually mess with the Philippines, they've got to take Taiwan first, so they could break into the first island chain. So again, this is not really a war that China wants. The Philippines have the advantage in this, and they are leveraging all their tools to get what is needed to get their point needed. And as Marcos wanted to be able to pass it along to future administrations, that is clear what the Chinese government is doing to deny the legal opportunities of the Philippine people. So that was the discussion of the articles this week. I did do a short video on Wednesday on the balloon war in Korea. So didn't write an article on that. That was just a video release talking about the trading of balloons, where South Korea was sending over balloons across the DMZ, excuse me, with messages from South Korean civil rights groups and anti-North Korean groups and North Korean defectors that live in South Korea, all sending messages across the DMZ, which included propaganda, hard currency, also USB sticks with South Korean dramas, TV show, and K-pop. The North Koreans didn't take that too well, and they sent over balloons with trash and manure in them, and it rained over in nearly 300 locations inside South Korea. South Korea wasn't sure what was in these, so it required a military response to investigate, meaning hazmat and nuclear, biological, and chemicals, to make sure that no hazardous materials were being sent across the border. So it became a major incident on the South Korean side because they did not know what was coming across. Nothing was identified as hazardous substance other than trash and manure. The South Koreans announced that they would take action against the North Koreans, and that it would be an unbearable pain for the North Koreans. North Koreans did relent and said they would no longer send over trash balloons across the DMZ. I think they realized that, even the North Koreans realized that maybe since that they didn't know what was in these balloons, that it caused the military response. So the 2018-2019 military dialogue treaty with between the two countries, South Korea has paused it in its entirety. Parts of it had already been frozen by the South Korean side because of the spy missile launch by the North Koreans, which is against the treaty. The South Koreans basically canceled parts of that treaty. That was going to happen anyway because the South Koreans launched a spy satellite of their own, not from the Korean Peninsula, but from a SpaceX rocket in Vandenberg, California. The North Koreans, in response to the suspension by the South Koreans of the part about the spy satellites, scrapped the whole deal. So the South Koreans, in response to the poop balloons, also canceled the whole agreement. So it's not really anything that was really being that was already being ignored at this point. So it didn't really. The South Koreans' position didn't really make that much of a difference if the North Koreans weren't going to abide by the deal. So the South Koreans, in response, started manning the outposts and started blasting K-pop and propaganda across the DMZ. Not sure there's going to be any other responses, but that is a major irritant to the North Koreans. So we'll see where it goes. It was kind of a tit-for-tat funny story of just some of the ridiculousness of the North Korean side. And again, missing probably realizing that they probably went too far because, again, by them not communicating with the South, that South had, and they talk about going to destroy the South and go rain a sea of fire, and they've threatened all types of threats against the South Koreans. The South Koreans didn't know what those were in those balloons, so I think they acted appropriately and not overboard. I think you had to send out your hazmat teams to investigate. And again, it blew up into a much bigger issue than I think even the North Koreans wanted. So that was what was in that video. So it's just a short video. I think it's under 4 minutes long. Kind of interesting. Hope you enjoy the writings this week. Thank you for listening. I'll try to clean up my delivery on this. I think my notes worked okay. I could clean up in some areas, but overall I think it worked fairly well. So please consider becoming a member or a subscriber or a follower on Substack, or support me on Patreon. It will be a big help. I'm working on trying to become an authoritative sources on many things, on my writings. So it helps that I have more followers and more subscribers. It shows a level of legitimacy. It doesn't make my writing any better, but it does help when somebody looks at somebody that's got a dozen followers versus somebody that has 5,000. So please consider becoming a subscriber or a follower. Also, I got a question about the writing is I do put a lot of posts out there, and I put them in different formats. I post on YouTube, I post on Substack. There's nothing exclusive that gets put on Rumble or YouTube or Locals that doesn't go on Substack. So there's no exclusivity anywhere, except for everything comes from Substack. So, but what I do is when you see so many postings out there is that I'm trying to create content in any way you want to consume it. If you want to consume it on Substack, if you want to test out a sample before you commit to making a reading, or say, hey, this interests me, see what is this about. So I'm trying to put as many different types of media to try to fit how different readers want to take in my content. So I do a lot of different size videos. I do different size audio casts. And I put it on many different locations to try to find where people want to go to read their books. Some want to see videos on Substack, but others like the interface of YouTube. But then you got other big tech people that don't like YouTube, so they rather go to Rumble or Substack or Locals. So I'm trying to provide content that works best for wherever my audience wants to come from. So that's why I have so many different variations of the same thing. But again, there's nothing exclusive on those other locations that is not on Substack. Everything is on Substack. That's where it all originates from. So that's why you see everything on Substack. So that's kind of my reason why you see so much types of postings on Substack, is I'm trying to create content to wherever my audience wants to consume my content. So that's my thinking on that. So again, I will put all my contacts in the comments section of this writing. And until next week, I hope all of you have a great week. Thank you for all the reads. Actually, last week was a record number of reads on Substack. So thank you for that. It actually turns out that this unscripted podcast is the most popular format that I have. So a lot of when you read coming from YouTube, Rumble, they talk about short content always does better. And actually, when you look at the numbers, short content does better, but this long content does better than any other. Though I suspect it's so long as people listen to part of it, they close it out, go on about do something else, and they come back and pick it back up. So you probably, maybe somebody listens to it 2 or 3 times before they go through the whole thing. So that's probably what's pushing the numbers up. But right now, this Unscripted podcast is the most popular medium I have. I will try to continue to make it better, try to come up with better options for it. I'm trying to see where my audience is and then see what makes sense to continue. I hope that the West Philippine Sea newsletter continues the popularity or picks up in popularity. I think it's an important topic. But again, I'm very curious in what goes on in that region. But if it's not what my audience wants to read, I will find other options for that. But I hope that it continues to get some traction. I'm hoping it picks up in the traction. So again, all the content will, all the descriptions will be in this podcast in the comments section, or not the comment section, in the detail section. So until next week, all of you have a great week, and I will talk to all of you later. Thank you. Bye.